It was an ordinary night in Maplewood, a small town forgotten by time. But for James Whitmore, that night would be unforgettable. Lying in the back of an old pickup truck, he gazed at the starry sky next to Eleanor Ellie Hayes. The warm summer breeze tousled her golden hair as they whispered plans about a future that seemed promising. "Do you promise?" Ellie asked with a shy smile. "No matter what happens, you'll never forget me?" James turned his face toward her, his eyes filled with certainty. "I swear, Ellie. I'll wait for you, as long as it takes." She smiled, satisfied. The next day they would run away together. They would leave Maplewood behind, seeking a life away from the judging eyes and rules that tried to tear them apart. It was a perfect plan. But promises can be broken. That same night something happened. A sudden noise. Tires screeching. A stifled scream. And then, silence. Ellie disappeared. Without a trace. No goodbyes. As if she had never existed. James searched. For days. Weeks. Months. But no one knew anything. The police treated the case as if Ellie had never been there. Neighbors said she had probably just left. But James knew that was a lie. He never gave up. Even when the years passed. Even as his hair turned gray and youth slipped through his fingers. He waited. Waited for 50 years. Until one late afternoon she returned. James lifted his eyes from the dusty shelf of his bookstore and saw a woman standing at the door. It was Ellie. The same eyes. The same face. The same shy smile. Time hadn't touched her. And in that instant James knew. Something was terribly wrong. James felt the air escape from his lungs. His mind told him it was impossible, but his heart screamed that it was real. Ellie was there. 50 years later, unchanged. As if time hadn't passed. He blinked, trying to decipher the face he had dreamed of finding again. The wrinkles on his own hands were proof that the world had changed. But she was exactly the same. "Ellie?" His voice came out weaker than he had expected. The woman smiled gently. "Hi, James." A shiver ran up his spine. There was something in her voice, a calmness that didn't make sense. How could someone return after half a century and still seem so serene? James staggered backward, seeking support from the counter. "No, it can't be." He shook his head, feeling reality slip through his fingers. Ellie tilted her head slightly, watching him as if she expected that reaction. "Can we talk?" The question echoed in the empty bookstore. The same place James had kept for years. The same one where he spent his afternoons, lost among books that never changed, just like him. Because, in truth, he never moved on. His friends married, had children, grandchildren. The town grew, aged, changed. But he didn't. He lived every one of those 50 years waiting. Waiting for a ghost. And now that ghost was there. James took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, Ellie was still there. It wasn't a dream. Where have you been?" His voice faltered. The question that haunted him for 5 decades. Ellie lowered her gaze as if carefully choosing her words. "It's a long story, James. But I'm here now." James furrowed his brow. Something in those words sounded wrong. He looked at her again as if trying to find a flaw, a sign of time. But there was none. Nothing. And then a terrifying thought crossed his mind. That couldn't be Ellie. Whatever was standing in front of him, it wasn't natural. And he needed to uncover the truth. The silence between them was suffocating. The clock on the wall of the bookstore read 6:27 p.m. James had never paid attention to the ticking of the hands before, but now every tick seemed like a blow against his sanity. Ellie was still there. Standing. Waiting. But James couldn't move. He observed every detail. The shine in her eyes, the way her chest rose and fell slowly with each breath, the way her hands were slightly clasped in front of her body. Everything about her seemed real. But it didn't make sense. "Say something," Ellie asked, her voice soft, almost pleading. James swallowed hard. I searched for you." Ellie nodded slowly as if she had expected that answer. "I know." That was a shock. "How do you know?" He took a step forward. His heart pounded as if trying to warn him of something. Ellie took a deep breath. "I can't tell you everything yet, James. But I promise I never meant to hurt you." It was the same voice. The same look. The same Ellie. But James felt that something was wrong. Very wrong. For 50 years he had lived tormented by her absence. He tried everything to find her. He called the police, dug through records, searched for clues in the newspapers. But it was as if Ellie had been erased from the world. And now she was simply there. But without a single mark of time. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, shaking his head. "People age, Ellie. They change. They bear the weight of the years. But you. She just looked at him. Without responding. Where have you been? He insisted, his voice firmer now. Ellie lowered her gaze, biting her lower lip as if fighting something inside her. I was taken, James. The world seemed to stop. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Taken? By who? Why? Ellie raised her eyes to him, and James saw something there that made him shudder. Fear. A deep, silent fear. She opened her mouth to answer, but suddenly the bookstore bell rang again. Someone had entered. James turned to see. It was a tall man in a dark suit standing in the doorway. His face was calm, too calm. Ellie's eyes widened, and her expression changed for the first time since she appeared. She was terrified. The stranger smiled softly and spoke, his voice cold and sharp. Eleanor, it's time to go. James felt his stomach churn. What the hell was happening? And more importantly, who had Ellie been with for the last 50 years? The air in the bookstore grew heavy. James felt a chill run up his spine as he stared at the man standing in the doorway. Tall in a dark suit, an impassive face, and empty eyes. Ellie took a step back as if every fiber of her body screamed to flee. Ellie? Who is he? James asked, never taking his eyes off the stranger. She didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. The man maintained his cold smile and took a step forward. Time to go, Eleanor. You've spent too much time here. James felt the instinct to protect her. Even without understanding what was happening, he knew Ellie was terrified. He moved to stand between them. She's not going anywhere. The man tilted his head slightly as if finding that curious. Oh, James? He sighed. Still so stubborn after all these years. James felt his stomach churn. The man knew his name. His fists clenched. Who the hell are you? The man smiled faintly. I am an old friend, and I've come to take what is mine. What is mine? James felt his blood run cold. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, as if about to say something she had feared for a long time. Then her voice came out soft, trembling. James, he's the reason I disappeared. James felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. 50 years of questions, of pain, of sleepless nights trying to understand what happened that night. And now the answer was right there. He looked at Ellie, desperately searching for an explanation. What do you mean by that? What did he do to you? The man chuckled lowly. She never told you, did she? James gritted his teeth. Told me what? Ellie looked at him, her eyes full of sadness. James, I never left by my own choice. Silence. James's heart raced. Ellie took a deep breath. I was taken. That night, I was going to meet you, but they found me first. James felt his head spin. They? Who are they? She hesitated, but then whispered. People who aren't from this world. James froze. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to say it was madness. But something inside him knew it was true. Because Ellie was there. Not having aged a single day. The man took another step forward, and his presence seemed to weigh heavily in the room. Enough of the secrets, Eleanor. You knew this moment would come. James saw the terror on her face. Ellie looked at him one last time. James, forgive me. And then, the lights flickered violently. The window glass shattered and a loud buzzing filled the air. James tried to run to Ellie, but in the blink of an eye, she vanished. Just like that night 50 years ago. And once again, he was left behind. The silence that followed was deafening. James stood in the middle of the destroyed bookstore, his heart beating so hard it felt like it was about to explode. Ellie had disappeared. Again. Just like 50 years ago. The man in the dark suit was no longer there. The broken glass reflected the flickering light from the lamps, casting trembling shadows across the floor. James staggered back, trying to understand what had just happened. This isn't possible. This isn't possible. He murmured to himself, his mind fighting against the truth. But then he felt something. A weight in the pocket of his jacket. Shaking, he stuck his hand in and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the note. And when he read those words, his blood ran cold. If you still want answers, go to the cabin by the lake. Find me before they find me again. Ellie. The cabin. That same cabin where, when they were young, they planned to run away together. James's heart raced. He had two choices, ignore it all and move on, or chase the truth. He didn't hesitate. Night had fallen by the time James arrived at the cabin. Time had not been kind to the place. The porch boards were rotten, and the door creaked at the slightest touch. Everything was abandoned, except for one detail. the lit candles. James slowly moved forward, the note still clutched in his hand. Ellie? His voice echoed through the silence. Nothing. He entered, the scent of aged wood filling his nostrils. On the wall there was a turned-over frame. When he touched it he felt something behind him. An envelope, with his handwriting. But the date was from 50 years ago. His eyes rushed to the first line. James, if you're reading this, it means you finally managed to find me. But there are things you need to know. His chest tightened. Had Ellie written this 50 years ago? How was that possible? He kept reading, devouring each word. I never ran away. I was taken. But not by ordinary people. They don't belong to this world. And now, I don't belong to it anymore. James felt a lump form in his throat. Time hasn't passed for me. I've lived outside of it. I tried to come back, but I was always pulled back to where they are. I've seen things no one should see. Learned truths no one should know. His hands began to shake. But now, I've escaped. But they won't leave it like this. Suddenly, a noise from outside. Footsteps. James froze. He tucked the note in his pocket and slowly moved toward the window. His heart pounded in his chest. In the darkness, a shadow moved between the trees. Then he saw him. The man in the dark suit. He was there. Time stopped. The stranger raised his hand and pointed directly at James. And in that instant James knew. He wasn't there to take him. He was there to silence him. The silence that remained in the bookstore was deafening. Ellie had disappeared. Again. James stood there, frozen, feeling his heart beat irregularly. The shattered glass from the window sparkled under the dim light of the sign outside. The hum that had filled the room moments before was now just a distant echo. But the worst part was the feeling of déjà vu. 50 years ago he lost Ellie. Now it had happened again. But this time, he wouldn't accept it. James felt something different this time. Not just desperation, not just pain. Anger. Someone took Ellie. Again. And now he knew it wasn't just any disappearance. There was something much bigger behind it. He grabbed the phone, his hands trembling, and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. Hello? The voice on the other side was deep, heavy with an old exhaustion. Ben, it's me. James. Silence. Then a sigh. James, it's been decades. I know. But I need your help. It's about Ellie. The silence on the other end thickened. Then Ben said something that made James's skin crawl. She's back, isn't she? James pressed the phone against his ear. What do you mean by that? I tried to tell you years ago. But you didn't want to listen. James closed his eyes, struggling against the avalanche of memories. Ben had always suspected something about Ellie's disappearance. But back then, James didn't want to believe his friend's theories. The police had already given up on the case. Everyone said Ellie had just left. He didn't want to believe anything that didn't make sense. But now, there was no escaping the truth. Ben, who took Ellie? His friend was silent for a moment. Then his answer came like a blow. They're not human, James. They never were. A chill ran down James's spine. Who are they? The same ones who took Ellie that night. The same ones who have been watching for years. James felt his breath grow heavy. The man who came to take her. He knew my name, Ben. He knew who I was. Ben scoffed on the other end of the line. Of course he did. They've always known. James felt a lump in his throat. Ben, what happened to Ellie in those 50 years? There was a pause. Then Ben said the words that made everything spin. For her, maybe 50 years haven't passed. James went silent. What do you mean? Ben took a deep breath. Maybe for Ellie it's only been days, or hours. James's heart stopped. It was the only explanation for her returning exactly the same. No signs of time. No wrinkles. No scars. It was as if she had never really left. Or worse, as if she had never been here to begin with. James felt the world spin. 50 years, and for Ellie it had only been hours? This was impossible. This was madness. Ben, are you saying she hasn't aged because time didn't pass for her? His voice came out hoarse, incredulous. On the other end of the line, Ben sighed. It's not just time, James. It's something much worse. James closed his eyes, trying to piece things together. Ellie disappeared without a trace. There were no witnesses, no clues. It was as if the world had forgotten she ever existed. And now she was back, untouched, as if she had never left. James forced himself to ask, where has she been, Ben? What happened to her? Ben took a while to answer. But when he spoke, his voice was heavy with an ancient weight. There are places, and there are forces, that don't follow the rules of our world. Ellie was taken by something like that. James felt his heart race. Something like that? What are you talking about? Ben hesitated. They are ancient, James. Too ancient. And they're not from here. James felt a cold shiver run down his spine. They? You mean extraterrestrials? Ben laughed softly without humor. If it were that simple. James furrowed his brow. Then what are they? His friend took a deep breath as if he knew there would be no turning back after this. They don't live in our time, James. Not even in our space. But occasionally, they come. James felt a bitter taste in his mouth. Come to do what? Ben was silent for a moment. Then he said, Tests. James felt his stomach churn. Tests? You mean, experiments? Exactly. And Ellie? Ben paused. Ellie was one of them. The bookstore spun around James. Tests. Experiments. He had spent 50 years believing that Ellie had been kidnapped, killed, or had run away for some unknown reason. But the truth was something he could never have imagined. James felt a lump in his throat. Ben, the man who came to take Ellie. He seemed normal. Because they seem normal, James. They learn from us. They disguise themselves. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every word. And Ellie? What did they do to her? Ben was silent for a moment. Then he said something that made James's heart stop. She may not be the same Ellie you knew. James felt a shiver. What do you mean by that? Ben answered with a single sentence. What if she's not the original? James's eyes widened. If she's not the original, then who or what came back to him? The weight of Ben's words hit James like a sharp blow to the chest. What if she's not the original? His mind refused to accept it. It couldn't be true. But what if it was? If Ellie wasn't the same girl he had known 50 years ago, then who, or what, had come back? James felt his stomach churn. His whole body trembled, but he knew what he needed to do. Ben, I need to find her. I need answers. On the other end of the line, Ben sighed. Then you need to go to where it all began. James knew exactly what he was talking about. The old bridge. The last place Ellie was seen before she disappeared. Night. The bridge was in the isolated part of town, where the forest stretched for miles. The cold wind cut through his skin as he parked the car and got out, his footsteps echoing on the wet asphalt. And then, she was there. Standing at the edge of the bridge, looking down at the dark water below. James's heart raced. Ellie? He shouted, running toward her. She turned slowly and her face was the same. But her eyes, there was something different. A deep sadness. An impossible weight to carry. You came? Her voice was a whisper. James stopped in front of her, breathless. Ellie? I need to understand. I need to know the truth. She looked down, tears silently streaming down her face. The truth will destroy you, James. He swallowed hard. You haven't aged, Ellie. 50 years have passed, but for you, it feels like it was yesterday. Where have you been? What did they do to you? She shuddered. And then, finally, she answered. I'm not the same Ellie you knew. The confirmation was a punch to the stomach. James staggered back, feeling the world crumble around him. No, it can't be. Ellie closed her eyes. They recreated me, James. They rebuilt me, piece by piece. I am a copy. James felt the tears burn in his eyes. No, you're real. You're here. I'm touching you. He held her hands, feeling her warm skin against his. She was real. But Ellie smiled sadly. I look real. I feel like a real person. But I'm not. James shook his head frantically. I don't care. You're the Ellie I've waited for my whole life. She gently held his face, her eyes filled with pain. And that's why I need to go. James's heart broke in that moment. No, please. Ellie smiled, but tears flowed endlessly. I loved you, James. And that part is real. But I don't belong to this world. I was never meant to come back. The wind blew stronger. The moon shone over the dark water. And then, Ellie took a step back. James screamed and tried to hold her, but it was too late. Her body disintegrated before his eyes, like dust in the wind, as if she had never existed. James fell to his knees, sobbing. 50 years of waiting. And all that was left was emptiness. James was alone. Alone as he always should have been. The bridge was empty. The wind blew gently as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't turned upside down in the past hours. But he knew the truth now. Ellie was no longer hers. She had been transformed, shaped, recreated by forces he could never understand. A copy of someone he loved, but not the true Ellie. The thought made him drown in a sea of confusion and pain. What remains of someone who has been torn from their own destiny? The answer seemed obvious. Nothing. But deep inside him a small flame still burned. A hope that, despite everything he couldn't extinguish, Ellie had come back to him. And for a moment she loved him. But now, what remained? He sat on the edge of the bridge, the water flowing just below, a quiet rush that seemed to mock the pain he felt. Nothing seemed real anymore. That was when a shadow formed in front of him. The man. The same man who had taken Ellie. He stood at the edge of the bridge, his gaze as impassive as always. James slowly stood up, his body trembling. You killed her." His voice came out hoarse, broken. The man simply watched. There was no anger in his gaze, no regret. Only an unsettling neutrality. "I didn't kill her. I just returned her to her place." His voice was calm, cold. James lunged forward, his fist clenched so tightly his nails almost pierced his skin. "She loved me. She waited for me. You destroyed everything." The man looked at him, unhurried in his speech. But the silence only increased James's pain. "What do you want from me?" James demanded, already out of breath. "I want nothing from you, James. I never did." The man took a step forward, his eyes still cold as if preparing to say goodbye. "But he stopped. "You still might have something. Something she asked for." James furrowed his brow. "What are you talking about? What did Ellie ask for?" The man approached and, with a smooth gesture, pulled something from his pocket. It was a small crumpled piece of paper worn down with time. He extended it to James. James hesitated, then took the paper, his breath tight. He slowly unrolled it, feeling the weight of every second that passed. On the paper there was a single sentence, written simply but full of meaning. "Tell him I have no regrets. Tell him I love him." James felt the world collapse around him. Those words, simple yet so profound. Ellie's love was there even though she was no longer. She loved him. She still loved him. Tears formed in his eyes, and he knelt at the edge of the bridge, gripping the paper tightly, as if it could anchor him back to reality. The pain and longing were overwhelming. The man didn't move. He watched as if waiting for something. James lifted his head, his eyes shining with sadness and despair. "She asked me for this. She asked me to believe that what we had was real." The man gave a slight nod. "She loved you. And she always will. That's all she could leave behind." James looked once more at the paper, his hands trembling. "Then, why did she have to go?" He whispered, almost to himself. The man didn't answer. He simply walked away as if his task was complete. But before disappearing into the darkness of the night, he turned one last time and, in an almost imperceptible tone, said, "Some things never disappear, James. True love is a force that transcends even time." And with those words he was gone, leaving James alone at the edge of the bridge. But even in the emptiness forming around him, something inside him changed. He stood up, still holding Ellie's paper tightly in his hands. She loved him. She would always love him. And with this final memory, James knew that something much greater was happening, something he could never fully understand. But whatever it was, it didn't matter anymore. He was ready to let go, to move on, to live even if his soul would never be the same. The goodbye was painful, but at least now he had peace. Ellie's last word was all he needed. Love never fades. So, what did you think of James and Ellie's journey? What do you think happened with the mysterious man? Do you think James's love will really transcend everything as he believes? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next emotional stories. See you in the next chapter.